Greetings and welcome to the first annual Pacific Northwest Multicultural Reader Series and Film Festival, powered by Zoom Catchers. We're so pleased to introduce Tim Golden, who will introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Denise, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Golden, and for those of you who don't know me, which I suspect is many of you, I am an actor here in the Pacific Northwest. I live in Walla Walla, Washington, but I have done a good amount of work in Portland, Oregon with the August Wilson Red Door Project, performed several monologues over the past several years in the stage play Hands Up. And I have also done some work with Passion Art Theater Company, performing as Hambone in Two Trains Running about 3 years ago in 2018. So I am fortunate to be joined today by a distinguished group of panelists whom I will introduce after I talk a little bit about the topic of this webinar, which is addressing color, colorism, and culture in theater and film. For those of you who have been looking on the program at the webinar description, you'll notice that the summary of our topic today is really about the gap between rhetoric and reality. We have a rhetoric that purports to be a culture of wokeness and social awareness, but yet and still in the theater and film industry, we often come across realities that don't meet up with our rhetoric, that are inconsistent with our rhetorical proclamations. And so what we aim to do in this webinar is discuss this elephant in the room, as the summary points out, and that elephant in the room is color, colorism, and culture in the theater and film industry. So we have joining us today as our panelists, and there are four distinguished panelists who are with us. First is Jamil Jude, who is the artistic director at True Colors Theater. We also have Fernando Luna, the producing artistic director at Latino Theater Projects. We also have Olga Sanchez, who is the assistant professor of theater at Middlebury College and former artistic director of Milagro Theater. And last but certainly not least, we have with us Samson Syharath, who is managing artistic director at Theatr Diaspora. So the way we're going to proceed is going to begin with the panel discussion. So I'm going to ask some questions of our panelists and have them discuss them. And then toward the end, in the last 15 minutes or so, we will have time for questions from our attendees who will be sending their questions in through the chat feature. So we're looking forward to that. All right, so color, colorism, and culture in theater and film. I guess we could start out by putting this question in general to the entire panel, and then we can hopefully get some good discussion about it. Colorism is something that is different from race. I think that's important to remember. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 which effectively ended Jim Crow in the United States, was signed into law by President Johnson, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, creed, or color. So color is something other than race. And historically, in communities of color, colorism has been about a certain preference for lighter skinned persons over darker skinned persons. So I'm curious to see what the panelists think about colorism, and let's take that into account first in terms of casting. I'm curious to see how our panelists have dealt with this issue in casting. Have you seen it? If you have seen it, how have you addressed it? And have you found yourself in situations where you may have a certain unconscious bias that has led you in a direction that could be labeled as colorist or colorism? So let's begin with, let's begin with any panelist who wants to tackle this, and I'd like to hear each one of you say a little bit about it.
I'm going to jump in. Thank you so much, Tim, and I really appreciate your framing. It really opens up what we're diving into here. Olga Sanchez, salt white, light skin Latina. I'm only equipped to speak anecdotally about colorism to a certain extent, but I just wanted to add another framing, which is, well, two things I'd like to say. One is the framing of colorism also happens within our cultures. You know, it's not, you know, sometimes we see these as a people of color or BIPOC folk and the white community, and there's so much that goes on within our own community. So as a Latina, just want to acknowledge that. I have heard from Afro-Latinx folks who, speaking to casting, who find themselves in situations where they walk into a casting that's looking for someone who is Latinx or Hispanic or whatever, and because they're darker skinned, they're not perceived as Latino. They're not in the café con leche kind of, you know, model, the brownness that is associated, and that is really incomplete because Latinidad is not a race. Latinos, Latinx, Latine, we are expressed in many different cultures because of our histories. But I've known that to be an issue that has then inspired people to write plays about this thing. So it's really generated a rich field of playwriting of Afro-Latinidad. The same thing happens when they sometimes, though, and this kind of crosses into the culture world, is Black Latinos, Latinx, Latine will walk into a casting for African-American, and because of their Latinidad will also be perceived as not Black. So they find themselves between a rock and a hard place. That's my contribution to this as a not personally.
Fascinating perspective, Olga. Thank you for that. Anyone else like to address this?
Yeah, I'd like to bounce off of what Olga said, because even in the Asian community, there is colorism, whether it's East Asian or Southeast Asian or South Asian. And then when we're kind of grouped together as AAPI, which is Asian American Pacific Islander, there's a whole nother group that is kind of lumped into this kind of vague race. And I've talked to a lot of Pacific Islander community members, and it does seem like Pacific Islanders on their own are sort of shadowed by Asian Americans when it comes to AAPI Heritage Month. They've talked to me about possibly just having their own month to celebrate their heritage because their culture is so different. And so I think it is important to talk about how colorism, how we can zoom in to specific cultures and see how colorism affects that.
Thank you, Samson. Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, I think colorism is actually a consequence, and also it is engineered from the process of conquest, you know, imperialism and hegemonic culture has set up even communities of color to be prejudiced about their own shadow of the blackness of or Asians, you know. Latin America, I'm specifically from Mexico, from northern Mexico, which is also perceived as a more light skin, more white kind of sort of region, because the history of Germans and, you know, Spaniards, less presence of native people like in central Mexico. So even Mexico is like a 3 or 4 different countries, and it's a very racist country too. Mexico is a very, very racist country, on the top of a very classist country. So in Mexico, you learn colorism in your household, you know. You have a nephew and then they go like, oh, he's so cute and his skin is so light, or he's so white, or his eyes are, uh, green, it's like, built they built culture where if you lighter skin than your siblings, you feel less, or you feel that you got less chances for everything, you know. So I think, yeah, colorism is not only in white predominant cultures, it's being exported. It is part of colonialism. It's a sequel of colonialism. Uh, and also is kind of a way to introduce junk, cultural junk, and um, cultural cosmology. Is pandemic. I think it's everywhere. It's in Africa, it's in Asia, it's heavily in Latin America because we came from, all these brutal conquest process. So yeah, I think that is everywhere, and hopefully through education and more information available to the masses, we can at least gain more consciousness about that, and about how we are constructed ourselves, uh, and do some work about it.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you. Jamil, we have not heard from you yet. So what are your thoughts on colorism in the theater industry and specifically in casting or casting decisions?
Yeah, well, hey, thank you. I'm really happy to hear about the experiences and the thoughts from all of our panelists here, speaking specifically to how different communities wrestle with this idea. I think in a larger American cultural context, I think we have to bring into the room this idea of anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness really is at the heart of colorism, right? It is the fear that if you're a child or if you or someone looks darker, that the fear is that they have some type of part of themselves that is expressed primarily through melanin expression, right? And that's that Blackness. I think it has perpetuated over time, and our industries are victim of it too, where when we think about what would be accepted, what would sell, I think we think about often in this entertainment industry with changes over the last decade or so, but through a white narrative lens, what will be accommodating to white eyes on television screens? So maybe we can tell Black stories, but if we tell them with Black people who are closer in complexion to white individuals, maybe have some of the same features, hairstyles, nose shapes, eyes, eye color, lip color, then maybe the introduction of this family, this idea, this concept may be able to pass, and pun intended on the idea of pass, right? So I think it has been manipulated and used as a way to govern the rate of acceptance. And you see it, and I think it is harmful. I think all of the conversations that happen, especially when Afro-Latine communities or our Southern Asian communities who tend to be darker, Southern Indian communities that tend to have people that look just like me, when they are excluded from conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but all of the participants in those conversations are lighter skinned representatives of the global diaspora, I think we are really showing anti-Blackness and the root that it has in so many of our communities, but definitely in our media and entertainment community.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very good, Jamil. I want to pick up on something that Fernando talked about because he did a nice job of talking about the depth of the problem and how colorism is ultimately rooted in a sort of white supremacist, imperial, and colonial project that aims to reproduce within communities of color a social stratification and a racial hierarchy, whereas the closer you are to being white, the more preferred you are in that within that culture. And so this raises a question, given Fernando's analysis of the depths of this problem, can it be overcome, and what is the role of artistic productions, particularly theatrical productions? Because the real power of art generally, and theater in particular, is its ability to tell counter stories and posit counter narratives to the dominant culture. So the question is, I guess, given its depths, as Fernando has discussed it, can colorism be overcome, and within the theater community? And if so, what are some of the ways that the theater community may strategize in order to be able to do that or make that happen without going too far in the other direction, without alienating people? This may be a lot to ask for, maybe it's all order, but I'm curious to see what the panelists think about this question. So again, this is open to anyone. We can begin with anyone. Jamil, we finished with you first go around, so maybe we could start with you now.
You know, absolutely. I'm happy to. You know, Olga and I go way back, so I saw her hand raised. So I didn't know if, Olga, you wanted something to say on this one, or I'm happy also to cede the floor to you here for a second.
Olga, I apologize. I did not see your hand.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's all good. Okay. The conversation flows. And I'm trying to remember what my point was going to be. And it had to do with something really important that I don't remember now. So clearly not that important. Thank you so much, Jamil. I appreciate that.
It will come back to you, Olga, I promise.
Thoughts.
And then well, you know, Tim, I think to your point, right? Like, I think it is, I think we can tackle it in multiple ways. So I don't want to say that this is an exhaustive list. So I think the first thing we can do, Olga mentioned that there is a whole canon of theatrical work that kind of plays on this idea of colorism in specific communities, right? Like, I know True Colors recently, what is recent anymore in this pandemic time, but we did a stage production of a show in 2018 of a play called Nina Simone, Four Women. That's written by Christina Ham. And the play inside of it, it represents Nina Simone's song, Four Women, where she actually talks about four distinct type of Black women. And some of it inherent in the play was this idea of colorism and classism and body size and image. So on stage, we had a play that explored these ideas inside the Black community. So where True Colors, as a theater that thrives at the intersection of artistic excellence and civic engagement, we were able to tease out these ideas and say, hey, Black community, because we are a Black theater company that is unabashed in our desire to tell Black stories to Black communities. We wanted to be able to pull that out and talk about it. I think also another way you can attach it are by, you know, roles that have historically been given to Afro-Latine, Black communities, darker skin, members of other, you know, global diaspora, people of the global majority are often best friends. They are often servants. They are secondary to the primary narrative, where the primary narrative are people of love interest and heroes, right? If we can intentionally cast with wide diversity, people who inhabit those roles, I think we tell a different story as well. When we see a beautiful dark-skinned Black woman as the eye and the apple of affection for everybody in a piece, it tells a different story than if this woman is lighter skinned, right? And I think the final piece is about being consistent. Right now, I think theater has been going in waves. In the 90s, we saw a lot of color conscious, colorblind casting. But we have just recently seen from all the data that is out there that as of just like 2017, 2016, the representation of people of color were so low and colorism was so affected in that. We have to maintain this level of consistency. It can't just be, oh, we do a couple of shows, look at us. It has to be, this is the new way in which we tell stories. We prioritize, we're conscious about the way we represent the full color spectrum of any given ethnic group on stage.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you, Jamil. Do we have another panelist who would like to address this issue?
I think Jamil really, made some excellent recommendations, particularly in terms of, those of us who have the privilege of selecting seasons. What playwrights we choose to, what stories we choose to include in our season in order to present the myriad of stories, as Jamil is talking about, the myriad of stories and the myriad of points of view that are out there that raise these perspectives. I think one of the gifts that we have right now is that more people are talking about colorism, and particularly within the Latina and Latinx community. There's a lot of work going on. We're having lots of conversations, lots of soul searching. I was thinking about your question. This was my idea that came back, Tim, which was about like how is my own bias evident? And I will say that when casting certain productions, and it's not that, it's an interesting thing. So I have cast plays that are set, that are written from like the Caribbean, Venezuela. I've cast them when it is my casting. I've cast them very diverse, Black bodies, lighter skinned bodies, etc. When it comes to Mexican plays, or I think an Argentine play, and I don't know if it's because it's been Spanish speakers who come to the auditions. It wasn't until we had a darker skinned actors who came to the auditions that they started getting folded in. So that's part of it. But I know that that's the way I was casting, was with a particular idea of who the Mexican was versus who the Cuban might be. And that's my own bias, misunderstood. And then of course it comes out that there's like millions of Black Mexicans who have been undercounted, underrepresented, which goes back to Fernando's point about the lingering legacy of mestizaje, which basically, it's a wrong term, but it kind of said everybody's equal. We're a mixed race here. We're mixed people. But that blendedness was actually, it hid a historic a racism in place. So it said, oh no, we're all equal, but it didn't change anything in order to bring equity into the societies. It just said we're equal and let's leave it the status quo, and lighter skinned people are going to live in the cities and have all the amenities. Darker skinned people are going to live in the coast where they, want to be, and everybody's going to be fine. Well, and no amenities and no resources. I mean, it's very wrapped up in history, as Fernando was pointing out. To colorblind casting, I just want to talk about, just bring up the point of, what we have. It doesn't work anymore because people do see color. We're still in a world where people make assumptions. It's to say that we're colorblind is like to say you can't read that I'm female presenting. That it's ridiculous. You can't read that I'm wearing a blue top. Maybe you can't. Maybe you can't see me. I'm wearing a blue top. I'm female presenting. I have long brown hair. But assumptions are made about presentation in this day and age. And until we get past that by, as Jamil recommended, how do we think of who's the protagonist in this story? When we get to where that's not an issue, then we can talk about colorblind casting, but we have to be intentionally cast in ways that disrupt a status quo that actually doesn't exist, that is a fabrication, that is a construct. I'm thinking about the movie that just came out that I love, but that is incorrect, which is In the Heights, right? For various problems, because it's not representing how many dark-skinned people there are in the Dominican Republic, and with the lead characters, and it's a flawed casting there, and it was flawed from the beginning. Lin-Manuel. Anyway, I'll step back.
I see. Very good. Thank you, Olga. Samson?
I'm gonna stuck on what Olga said about Like, why are you picking these playwrights? And I feel like colorism isn't just about the casting. There's so many layers. Colorism affects every part of the production process. Who's producing? Why are you producing? Why are you picking these plays? And I think it comes down to authenticity. Are you producing it so you can represent this culture and these voices, or are you doing it to check marks a box for funding? Because I feel like that's what I'm running up against a lot. And as a managing artistic director of a theater of color, it's really difficult to see these white organizations get funding producing these one-off plays. And yeah, I think that's something we should talk about too.
Mhm.
Okay.
I
Fernando.
completely agree with you. I completely
Fernando?
agree with you. Actually, I think that a whole industry is such a cultural junk that was implanted to us that that I think is even profiting right now from inclusion and to all these newborn industry to be inclusive in order to be more competitive, uh, to get grants or to be perceived on very specific lens. I think is very far from really doing the work that is necessary. It's a cheap way to just like, oh, we embrace this and now we're doing this show, just to show everyone, all the founders and the new audiences. Because also, you have to understand that demographics are changing. All the problems that we had last year with the riots everywhere uh, is also because it's a demographic war. The demographics in this country are changing dramatically. White people is not going to be a majority in just maybe 15 years. Uh, so I think that there is like a demographic war, you know. So just trying to be inclusive or to fight for new audiences, which is people of color, because it's going to be the majority. And because the white donors and the white, subscribers are dying or not walker, and, in the next 10, 15 years, they're going to disappear. A big portion of the money that supports uh, the big budget theaters everywhere. Um, so I think that there are lots of things in consideration. Now it's not just like, oh, now we're gonna cast, we're gonna this show and we're gonna try to cast blah 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 blah. That that uh, that fails. And as Olga mentioned it in the Heights, in the film, they fail with that. And also the reality is that the diversity of artists, especially in this country, needs to be included in the training and the preparation. I mean, the diaspora is so big, but usually, let's say African Americans who get in jail, school of trauma, get a contracts in Hollywood, it's because they fit certain colorism that is on demand. So we need to uh, uh, create more opportunities to the diaspora people of color, and not just the people who got very good education or that their parents got their stuff together, and the kids are, uh, I think that people that are in jail, for instance, all those theater programs are very important because is a very segregated part of our community, especially African descendant and Latino descendant. I think that the investment has to be in the community, where the community is at.
Okay. So thank you, Fernando. I want to pick up on something that you said and a point that Samson made, which I think is important. So, Fernando, you spoke about how the demographics in America are changing and certain people will die off and so forth and so on, and that maybe this problem won't exist as an institutional matter in a certain amount of time because of the changing demographics. But if we think about race and racism, which, as Jamil pointed out earlier, is really what colorism is. Colorism is sort of it's different from race. Race is different from color, but colorism is ultimately a reification of white supremacy through the social stratification of a hierarchy that posits lighter skinned people as being better than darker skinned people. So that, as Jamil pointed out, I think quite nicely, that is a form of anti-Blackness or white supremacy. So, with that being said, racism is less about individual behavior. I like to think of individual behavior as being bigoted or prejudiced, but racism, I think, refers to institutions. And oftentimes what we see in institutions is that people of color can be part of institutions, and the institution doesn't necessarily function any less racist just because people of color are part of it. And Samson raised the point about the motive, right? Why are we putting on these plays? Why are we producing certain performances? Are we doing it just to get money for our theaters, or are we doing it because we really care about the social problems that these stories purport to describe and tell, that we do as actors and directors and theaters and in filmmaking? So I'm curious as to see how can theater and film combat the institutional problem of racism and of course its companion or subset of problems that's generated by colorism, because individual changing of demographics could just produce in a bizarre kind of way a society that is equally as racist as the one we have now, where institutionally very little has changed. We just have different actors performing in it, even though whites may eventually soon be in the minority. So I'm curious as to hear what you all would have to say about theater's role, theater and film, their roles in combating the institutional problem that confronts us. And for some reason, the hand feature is not working, so I don't see hands from my end. So if someone is interested in jumping on this, by all means, please go right ahead.
Yeah, no worries, Tim. I want to quickly say, based on what Samson said earlier and you reframing it for us here, I think it's important for us, one, not to look to predominantly white institutional theaters for leadership here on these issues. They have never been the space where that type of leadership and advocacy has been sustained over time, either through, well, there's a myriad of reasons for why not. And I think we have to make sure that we continue to lean on our funding community to empower the theater companies that are represented here on this Zoom as people who have the experience, both the cultural legacy of it. Olga mentioned how she's had experience. Fernando talked about it specifically happening inside his own family, right? There's a lived experience of the people who run these types of institutions that even if we have, to Tim's point, fall victim of it, we have the cultural fluency and have the knowledge inside of our communities on how we can address the issues and then set up a system that changes our relationship to the challenge. While I do think that we should not let predominantly white larger institutions off, well, predominantly white institutions off the hook, because they have a responsibility to tell stories effectively, especially if they are if they are receiving public funds. They have a responsibility to the public to tell stories correctly. But I don't want for us to, if you believe that it's a zero-sum game, those dollars should be in the pockets of storytellers that have a closer relationship to authenticity than a colonizing group that has perpetuated these challenges, culturally instituted these issues, and now is somehow going to be the ones that get us out of it. That sounds ridiculous.
Thank you, Jamil.
I want to applaud that 100%. I think a couple of thoughts emerged. The idea of telling stories effectively, which I appreciate. I mean, it's on all of us. And there's ways in which also, and this goes back to Fernando's point about education, there's ways in which one, and this is like a reason why I'm in academia, was because there's no Latina, Latinx, I won't say no, there's some, but it's very little. And I'm trying to represent in academia so students emerge with knowledge in their toolkits about the diversity of the theater making that exists in this country. And that it doesn't all look like a Lort theater, a PWI, and their versions of diversity. Backing up a bit though, part of it is also how do we train our designers, our lighting designers, our makeup designers to serve, and if we're talking about anti-Blackness, to serve the darker skin in a way that's effective and brings out the best, not becomes a burden to the lighting designer. I've been in the room where the lighting designer has gone like, oh, now it's so hard. I'm like, fine, so it's hard, it's more difficult, not a problem. I know you can do it. You know, it's, how do we train our emerging designers to understand the palette of our skin colors and do it beautifully? I also think it's on us who feel this and feel a commitment to it, to how do we become audiences? How do we vote with our dollars where we go to see our theater? Where, you know, the shows that we support that don't just belong to our communities, but belong to our global majority communities. I would say that this conference, this very panel is an example of how to begin to talk about it, because I think racism has a different tone to it. And I think colorism also complicates it. But the fact that we can just sit here and talk about it without shame and just acknowledging that it is part of our society, and then so now how do we address it, is part of moving the dial, I hope. That we understand that there's an urgency to this because people's lives are at stake, frankly. But let's move past the shame of not being able to acknowledge and move into transformative choices. And I think it's beholden on us, those of us who can feel it more closely, to make the changes that we want to see. Gandhi.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you very much. Samson or Fernando, would you all like to chime in on this? We have just about 2 minutes left before we open it up to our questions from the Q&A session. So if either of you did have remarks, if we could keep that in mind, because we want to, and we're going to be ending the panel part of our webinar in just a few minutes here. So any concluding thoughts on this topic?
I just think that it's a lot of work ahead. It's not easy, but we all can do one action, you know, um, take one action every day as a routine and deconstruct yourself any sort of inherited colorism, racism, classism is a work that we have to do every day. So if we commit every day to one action to help ourselves to move forward, I think it's very good and it's something tangible.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you very much. Samson?
Yeah, I'll just say that I agree with everybody else. And I think for us to see change, we have to change what we're doing. We can't just expect things to change just because we're talking about it. We have to have action.
Okay. Thank you, Samson. Thank you very much. So that concludes our panel portion of our webinar. And thanks to all of you for your insightful commentary on this important issue of color and colorism and culture in theater and film. I think our audience has a lot to take with them after seeing this conversation. So let's take our first question from our audience. And that first question is, what role does social media play in perpetuating colorism? So do we have a panelist who would like to address this?
I'll go ahead and tackle it. I'm a social media user, and I think it's exactly the same thing, right? Like, we know the importance of narrative. We know the importance of visual storytelling. So, and how we repost things and the people that are represented. I think that's an important aspect of the conversation. Sometimes we can get in these echo chambers where we believe things are different because of how diverse or lack of diversity that we see in our own social media circles. So I'm just going to encourage that if you see something like that, like share it around, especially as we try to beat back anti-Blackness or anti-Asian sentiment. The more we can share images of beautiful dark-skinned people, and in sharing happiness and counter narratives on our social, I think we start to put out there and impact and influence the way people perceive culture.
Good, thanks.
I want to second that. I mean, I think there's ways in which social media can move so quickly, and I think and also it's run or operated or presented by a whole host of forces. Some of it is just us individuals. Oh, I'm forwarding this thing, I'm tweeting this thing, I'm sending out this thing, and some of it is, there's people creating images like commercials, it's like the same thing. So there's people with vested interest in getting particular kinds of images and messages out there. But for those of us who have agency and can make our own choices, back to Jamil's point, I would say, look, can we take a pause before we send something and just take a look at what it is we're sending, read what it is we're sending, and think twice before we hit the send button. I think, with a little bit, because it is about consciousness, because some of it is our, what's that word? It's a bias, but it's an underneath bias, right? It's our unconscious bias. And so that's the point, is that we don't even know we have it, and we're sharing it with others. So if we actually, knowing what we know, take a second to critique our own message, back to Jamil's point, and recognize that, oh my goodness, I almost sent that out. And wait a minute, it doesn't have to be that. Can I do something else?
Thank you, Olga. Anyone else like to address this?
I'm also interested because we haven't said anything about cancel culture or call out culture, because I think that happens a lot on social media where I have my own personal opinions, but I'm also interested in what everyone else thinks about what calling out or cancel culture means to you, because I feel like that separates. I understand that I feel like we can open it up for a conversation. And if that doesn't work, then I'm all for canceling somebody. Like, I don't, if someone's not going to listen, then I'm okay not listening or seeing them ever again. But I'm interested in how can we come together to learn and grow from a situation. And yeah.
I'm thinking, Samson, you're reminding me of the phrase calling in. The notion that I'm not here, I'm not trying to create shame, I'm trying to make change. And make change is to make you aware, hey, did you notice? And maybe that's done privately, maybe that's done aside, maybe that's not done on, on the platform that everybody can see. But again, that's on us as participants. But I think that's one way.
Okay. Okay.
Even
All
though social media can be also a lynching space, it's when people try to address some very difficult issues in a very frivolous way. And you see all these extreme reactions. So yeah. Also, social media, as you know, provides all the filters. I mean, social media is colorism. People take a selfie and then they have the options to correct themselves, correct the skin color. So is one of those things that since now we can be our own editors in social media, they give you the tools to do it, and people is perpetuating that. Is frustrating, because I understand the aesthetics and you can make a picture more beautiful or whatever. But when it comes to colorism, you see it in people, taking selfies, and when you know the person and when you see their pictures on social media, they're all being, you know, highlighted. They're all being more light skin. So I think social media is also a place where colorism has found a very good niche.
Okay. Thank you, Fernando. So we have time for one last question for our panel from our audience. And that question is, what is the difference between colorism in the African American community and colorism in foreign communities of color?
I'll take that real quick. I would say there's a lot of the same dynamics. It's still proximity to whiteness. Everything that Jamil talked about as like the markers of superiority, supremacy, white supremacy. And so I think there are different dynamics at play. I'm not going to speak to the Black experience, but I know that one of the painful things, and I know this anecdotally, is because people will feel like they're in family and they're held by people they love and who love them, and yet cannot resist to comment on their hair or their skin color or their eye color or whatever it is. And it's just painful, even as you're in this loving family experience. So I don't know if, again, I can't speak to it, but I just know that that's a dynamic at work in the Latina and the Afro-Latina community, in the Latina family.
Okay. Thank you, Olga.
I know in the Asian community, like myself growing up, I remember my mother would pinch my nose because she didn't want it to be too wide, or she would make me stay inside and not play outside so that I would stay lighter skinned. And so it is kind of ingrained in us. And I think a way for us to think about it is to change what we view as like the beauty standard. There are so many apps and filters that make us look a certain way, but why do that when we are perfect the way we are?
Okay. All right. All right. Well, anyone else like to comment on this? Because what I would like, if not, what I would like to do is go through and get each panelist's thoughts on how we can continue this conversation. And if we've sort of talked about trying to get results already, but if anybody has any ideas as to how we might, A, not only continue the conversation going forward, but B, hopefully get some tangible results in terms of making improvement. I'm not sure we solve the problems of the world in this webinar, but maybe we can have a brief conversation or a brief commentary from each panelist on what we can do to at least move this conversation forward, or if any of you have any ideas as to how we might be able to secure some small victories in the battles that lie ahead within this overall war of color and colorism and culture and theater and film. So let's go through each of the panelists. Let's start with Jamil. I'd like each person to take maybe, I don't know if you can do this, and this might be unfair, but in about 30 to 45 seconds, if each of you could give your final thoughts. I know our time is running a little bit short. Let's give each person a minute. Give each person 1 minute to share your thoughts on this last question or on this last topic. So let's start with Jamil, then we'll go to Fernando, then Olga, and then we'll wind up with Samson. So.
You know, I really like what Samson said earlier about call in versus call out culture, right? Like, who wants actually to do something about this issue? Everybody is not worth our time and wasting our time, right? Like, some people are going to respond to a call in differently and feel like they are being accused, and their goodwill that they're trying to put out into the world isn't valued. So I say let's continue to try to find ways to call in and people who want to actually be engaged, and spend our energies on people who are interested in being part of the positive response and the change we want to see, as opposed to spending time dwelling on people who seem to not want to.
Thank you, Jamil. Fernando?
Also support someone who's doing the right thing. If you see a production, a movie, an independent film that is doing the work, or trying hard to do the work, support that, encourage that, buy a ticket, you know. And also those institutions, they have a lot of money and they want the status quo. Suggest them that, you know, that if they want your support, what would you like to see? You know, write them an email, talk to someone there. I think that's also, you know, using our dollar, using capitalism to counter the narrative that is preserving colorism, racism, and classism, and many other isms that derive.
Thank you, Fernando. Olga?
Yeah, thanks so much. I've really appreciated this conversation. And I would say this is one way to have a conversation like this that's multicultural, multi-diverse. So two things. One is, I think that we as, to a certain extent, representatives or people who are leaders in our own ethnic communities should lead by example, and should bring up the conversation, because it may not be brought up if we don't bring it up. So those of us who identify as leaders, as artists, as wherever we are, how do we bring it into the room? Identify the elephant in the room, as Tim mentioned earlier. So that's part of what we can do. Then I think there's also coalitional work. There's ways in which we can be supportive of each other's efforts, honoring how other communities are going about doing their work, and how can we participate, engage, support theater work that is putting out the right messages, the right images, right, on our humble opinions. And also, how do we as coalitions write letters together? So to Fernando's point, you know, write letters, you know, well, how do we sign a letter together that says, you know what, that was offensive, wrong, misplaced, etc., and harmful? How do we do that as because I think that's the scariest thing. And that's, I think, part of our next step is is what this conference is doing, which is, or this festival, which is creating coalition.
Very good. Thank you, Olga. And last but not least, Samson.
Yeah, I think something we could do is just pay attention, be a little bit more conscious. And then to Fernando's statement earlier about maybe just do one thing, realize that everybody can do something that can have an effect. And you know, we're going through a pandemic. There was a lot of almost every organization put a pause in what they were doing. So why not use that time to look around you, evaluate, self-evaluate who is at the table, who was this table built for, why are things the way they are, and how can we change it? And maybe just be a little bit more accountable for yourself. Try not to feel attacked. I think we're all wanting a better theater film community, and so realizing that it's not about putting you down, it's about bringing everybody up.
Thank you very much, Samson. On that positive note, I want to thank all of our panelists, Jamil Jude, Fernando Luna, Olga Sanchez, and Samson Syharath, for their insightful commentary and discussion on this very important issue. Thanks to those of you who have been with us in our audience through this webinar. Thank you for your questions, and we apologize we weren't able to get to all of them, but we again thank you for taking the time to engage with us in the way that you did. Again, thank you so much, and this will conclude this panel session, and I'm sure we all took a lot from it, and I hope we get a chance to do this again soon. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Thanks all.